The tapestry of fate is often woven with threads of both gold and ash, but for this particular emperor, those threads were irrevocably stained crimson from the very moment of his birth. His arrival wasn't heralded by joyous hymns or the sweet scent of incense, but by a chorus of dread, a symphony of shadows whispering a prophecy so abhorrent, so utterly monstrous, that it threatened to unravel the very fabric of his kingdom. We're talking about a prophecy that painted him not as a benevolent ruler, but as a devourer, a monster cloaked in royal robes, destined to consume his own flesh and blood. Imagine the scene. A grand and opulent birthing chamber, draped in the finest silks, normally a beacon of hope and new beginnings, now heavy with an almost palpable sense of foreboding. Midwives scurried about, their faces etched with a mixture of anticipation and, if we're honest, a hefty dose of terror. The queen, beautiful even in the throes of labor, cried out, her pain a counterpoint to the hushed whispers that snaked through the corridors of the palace. This was no ordinary birth. This was the arrival of a force that would either elevate the kingdom to unimaginable heights, or drag it down into the deepest, darkest abyss. And then he arrived, a seemingly healthy, robust babe, seemingly perfect in every way. But as the cries of the newborn filled the room, a chilling gust of wind swept through the palace, extinguishing the torches and plunging the chamber into momentary darkness. It was a fleeting moment, a trick of the light, some would say. But others knew, deep in their bones, that it was an omen, a sign of the horrors to come. Immediately following the birth, the royal astrologers, cloistered in their chambers high above the palace, pored over their charts, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight. They were the keepers of cosmic knowledge, the interpreters of the stars, and they had been tasked with divining the newborn prince's destiny. What they discovered sent shockwaves of fear through their ranks, a chilling revelation that threatened to shatter the very foundations of the kingdom. Their findings were delivered to the king in hushed tones, the message shrouded in euphemisms and veiled warnings, but the core truth remained terrifyingly clear. The prince, they declared, was destined to become a cannibal, to devour his own children in a desperate attempt to cling to power. Can you even imagine the sheer horror that gripped the king's heart? To learn that his heir, his own flesh and blood, was fated to commit such an unspeakable act. The weight of the prophecy must have felt like a physical burden, crushing him beneath its unimaginable weight. This wasn't just a threat to his lineage. It was a threat to the very soul of the kingdom. The prophecy itself, of course, didn't offer specifics. It didn't reveal when or how this monstrous act would occur. It simply stated, in chillingly vague terms, that the emperor would consume his children to survive. Survive what, you ask? That was the question that plagued the king and his advisors for years to come. Was it a threat to the throne? A devastating famine? A swift and merciless plague? Or something, perhaps, far more sinister? The ambiguity of the prophecy only served to amplify the fear and paranoia that festered within the palace walls. Every smile became suspect, every gesture analyzed, every whispered conversation scrutinized for signs of treachery. The king, once a just and benevolent ruler, became consumed by suspicion, his mind poisoned by the specter of his son's horrifying destiny. Just think about the psychological toll this would take. The constant dread, the gnawing fear that any decision, any action, could inadvertently trigger the fulfillment of the prophecy. It's a level of stress that would break even the strongest of wills. He was trapped, forced to walk a tightrope stretched across a bottomless abyss of uncertainty and fear. And what about the young prince himself? He grew up in the shadow of this terrible prophecy, blissfully unaware of the darkness that clung to him like a shroud. He was loved and doted upon, yes, but always with an undercurrent of fear and apprehension. Courtiers would smile at him, then quickly avert their gaze, whispering amongst themselves about the monster he was destined to become. His every action, every childish tantrum, Every act of defiance was interpreted through the lens of the prophecy, fueling the paranoia that gripped the court. Was this seemingly innocent act a sign of the darkness within? Was this childish outburst a harbinger of the horrors to come? Every misstep, every frown was magnified, distorted, and transformed into evidence of the monster lurking beneath the surface. In many ways, the prophecy became a self-fulfilling curse, shaping the prince's destiny in ways that were both subtle and profound. The constant suspicion, the veiled whispers, the ever-present fear, all of it contributed to the very darkness that they were so desperately trying to prevent. It was a vicious cycle, a downward spiral fueled by fear and fueled by ignorance. Astrologers, desperate to avert the impending doom, proposed countless solutions, each more bizarre and outlandish than the last. Some suggested sacrificing the prince to appease the gods, a solution the king immediately rejected, thankfully. Others proposed exiling him to a remote island, far from the reach of power, a plan that seemed equally unpalatable and equally cruel. The king, torn between his love for his son and his duty to his kingdom, found himself trapped in an impossible situation. He couldn't bring himself to kill his own child, but he couldn't ignore the prophecy either. He was a man caught between a rock and a very hard place, with the fate of his son and his kingdom hanging precariously in the balance. The birth of the emperor, therefore, wasn't a celebration of new life, but a grim warning, a chilling prelude to the horrors that were to unfold. It was the moment when the threads of fate were irrevocably twisted, setting the stage for a tragedy of epic proportions. And as the young prince grew, the shadow of the prophecy loomed ever larger, casting a pall of darkness over the entire kingdom. The countdown to the unspeakable had begun. The emperor's childhood was, to put it mildly, unusual. Imagine growing up knowing a sizable chunk of your kingdom views you as a potential monster. Not exactly the ideal environment for learning to share your toys. From the moment he could toddle, every stumble was interpreted as a sign of instability. Every childish tantrum a foreshadowing of tyrannical rage. His every action was dissected, analyzed, and twisted to fit the narrative of the prophecy. Was he kind to the stable boy? Clearly, a manipulative ploy to gain loyalty before the inevitable bloodbath. Did he refuse to eat his vegetables? A foreshadowing of his insatiable hunger for power, a prelude to consuming his own children. The court, of course, was a hotbed of anxiety. Courtiers practically tiptoed around him, their faces frozen in polite, yet clearly terrified, smiles. Imagine having every tutor, every nursemaid, every playmate eyeing you warily, wondering if today was the day the prophecy would manifest. It's safe to say the imperial playdates were anything but fun. His father, the king, a man burdened by the weight of his crown, and now the weight of this terrifying prophecy, tried to shield his son from the worst of it. But how do you shield a child from the whispers, the sideways glances, the palpable sense of fear that permeated the palace walls? He attempted to provide a normal upbringing, hiring the best tutors, ensuring the prince received instruction in swordsmanship, diplomacy, and the art of governance. But even in these seemingly normal activities, the shadow of the prophecy loomed large. Swordsmanship lessons became a test of his inner control. Could he master his aggression? Would he succumb to his darker impulses? Diplomacy lessons were a veiled attempt to teach him empathy, to prevent him from becoming a cold, calculating tyrant. And even the art of governance was taught with a subtle undercurrent of fear, a constant reminder of the immense responsibility that awaited him, a responsibility he might be inherently incapable of handling. His mother, the queen, adopted a different approach. She, too, was terrified by the prophecy, but she refused to let it define her son. She believed that love and discipline could overcome even the most malevolent of fates. She showered him with affection, nurturing his talents and encouraging his ambition. But beneath the surface of her love, there was a steeliness, a determination to mold him into the ruler she believed he could be, a ruler who would defy the prophecy and bring glory to the kingdom. She also, crucially, fostered his sense of isolation by subtly instilling in the emperor the idea that he was a special child, that the burden of his fate separated him from his siblings and, indeed, the very population that would come to be under his power. She was actively grooming him for the type of callous actions to come. The queen was playing a game as dangerous as any, and her son, the emperor, was the unknowing game piece. The emperor was acutely aware of the prophecy. Though the specifics were kept from him, he knew he was different, that he was burdened by a destiny that set him apart from others. He could feel the fear in the eyes of those around him, the constant scrutiny, the unspoken questions that hung in the air. This awareness fostered a deep-seated sense of insecurity, a feeling that he had to constantly prove himself, to demonstrate that he was not the monster they feared. He became a perfectionist, driven to excel in every endeavor. He mastered his studies, honed his swordsmanship skills, and immersed himself in the art of governance. He sought to embody the ideal of a benevolent ruler, a just and wise leader who would bring prosperity and peace to the kingdom. But the more he strived for perfection, the more isolated he became. He couldn't confide in anyone, couldn't share his fears or his insecurities. He was trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by courtiers who feared him and family members who saw him as a threat. As he grew older, the whispers grew louder, the scrutiny more intense. The court began to openly speculate about his future, about whether he would succumb to the prophecy or defy it. Factions formed, some supporting him, others plotting against him. The palace became a battleground of intrigue and ambition, and the emperor found himself caught in the crossfire. He learned to navigate this treacherous landscape with a mixture of cunning and caution. He mastered the art of deception, learning to mask his true feelings and intentions. He cultivated alliances, but always with a wary eye, knowing that even his closest allies could betray him at any moment. He also began to develop a keen sense of paranoia. He saw plots everywhere, imagined enemies lurking in the shadows. He trusted no one, not even his own family. This paranoia, fueled by the prophecy and the constant betrayals of the court, would eventually consume him, driving him down a path of madness and destruction. His childhood, therefore, was not a time of innocence and joy, but a crucible of fear and suspicion. It was a training ground for a king who would rule with an iron fist, a king who would be haunted by the specter of the prophecy, a king who would ultimately become the very monster he feared. The cracks were beginning to show, spiderwebbing across the once smooth facade of the emperor's reign. Little fissures of distrust, widening into gaping chasms of paranoia. It wasn't a sudden collapse, not a dramatic coup with clashing steel and spilled blood, but a slow, insidious erosion from within. Picture it, a magnificent tapestry, meticulously woven over years of rule, thread by thread being pulled loose until the whole thing threatens to unravel. It started with whispers, easily dismissed as courtly gossip. A misplaced word here, a secretive glance there. But the emperor, ever vigilant, ever watchful, saw the patterns forming, the connections tightening like a noose around his trust. The first to fall from grace was Lord Valerius, a man who had served as the emperor's personal scribe since childhood. He was diligent, precise, and possessed a memory that bordered on the eidetic. Valerius knew the emperor's secrets, the kingdom's secrets, everything. That, it turned out, was his undoing. A missive, intercepted en route to a neighboring kingdom, implicated Valerius in a plot to reveal sensitive information regarding troop movements and trade agreements. The evidence was circumstantial, a coded message that could be interpreted in multiple ways. But the emperor, his mind already fertile ground for suspicion, saw only betrayal. Valerius was dragged from his chambers in the dead of night, protesting his innocence all the way to the dungeons. He was tortured, of course. Gruesome but necessary, the emperor justified to himself. The confessions extracted were coerced, meaningless words spoken under duress. But they were enough. Valerius was publicly executed, his head displayed on a pike above the city gates as a warning to others. The emperor felt a pang of guilt, a fleeting moment of doubt, but quickly quashed it. Better to be safe than sorry. He reasoned. One rotten apple could spoil the whole barrel. Then came the incident with General Marius, the hero of the Northern Campaign. Marius was a celebrated warrior, a man of immense courage and unwavering loyalty. Or so everyone thought. Rumors began to circulate that Marius was amassing a personal army, exceeding the authorized troop levels for his garrison. Whispers of ambition, of a desire to seize the throne, reached the emperor's ears. These rumors were spread by those who stood to gain from Marius's fall from grace. The emperor summoned Marius to the capital. The general arrived, clad in his battle armor, his face grim, his eyes filled with an unspoken defiance. The meeting was tense, the air thick with suspicion. The emperor questioned Marius about the rumors, demanding an explanation for the unauthorized troop levels. Marius denied the accusations, claiming that he was merely preparing for a potential border skirmish. The emperor didn't believe him. Marius wasn't executed. He was too popular with the troops. Instead, he was stripped of his command, disgraced, and exiled to a remote outpost on the edge of the empire, a place where his talents would be wasted and his influence diminished. The emperor watched him leave, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. Had he made the right decision? Or had he just created a powerful enemy, simmering with resentment, waiting for an opportunity to strike? But the most devastating betrayal came from within his own family. His younger brother, Prince Cassius, a charming and charismatic figure, was discovered to be corresponding with a foreign power, offering them favorable trade concessions in exchange for their support. Cassius, driven mad by envy and a need to be powerful, sought the throne for himself. The documents were irrefutable, the evidence damning. The emperor felt a wave of nausea, a sense of profound betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. He confronted Cassius in private, his voice trembling with anger and grief. Cassius denied the accusations, pleading his innocence, but the emperor saw the truth in his eyes. He ordered his brother's arrest. It was a decision that haunted him. Family was supposed to be sacred, a bond that transcended political ambition. But in this world, in his court, even blood was a commodity to be bartered and betrayed. Cassius disappeared. No one knew where he had gone or what became of him. It was not spoken of in the court again. These betrayals, these instances of treachery, chipped away at the emperor's soul, reinforcing his belief that he was surrounded by enemies. He became increasingly isolated, withdrawing from the court, distrusting everyone around him. He saw conspiracies lurking in every shadow, plots simmering beneath every smile. The once benevolent ruler transformed into a paranoid tyrant, driven by fear and suspicion, forever haunted by the specter of betrayal. The tapestry was unraveling, the kingdom teetering on the brink of chaos, and the emperor, lost in the labyrinth of his own mind, was powerless to stop it. The whispers solidified into shadows. They coiled around the emperor, twisting his perception, painting every interaction with a brush dipped in suspicion. What began as fleeting doubts soon blossomed into full-blown paranoia, a suffocating cloud that choked the life out of his court and his sanity. He became a prisoner in his own palace, a fortress of gilded cages and watchful eyes. Every smile was scrutinized, every gesture analyzed for hidden meanings, every whispered conversation interpreted as a potential conspiracy. The air itself seemed to hum with unspoken treachery, a constant reminder of the invisible enemies that surrounded him. His family, once a source of comfort and support, now appeared as the most immediate threat. His brothers, each with their own claim to the throne, became objects of intense scrutiny. He saw ambition burning in their eyes, resentment lurking beneath their carefully crafted smiles. Every casual remark, every seemingly innocent suggestion, was dissected and reassembled into a potential plot against him. He remembered a hunting trip years ago, where his brother had accidentally shot an arrow far too close to him. Was that an accident or a failed assassination attempt? The thought lodged itself in his brain, festering and growing like a malignant tumor. His uncle, a seasoned warrior and respected statesman, was not exempt from suspicion. The emperor recalled a hushed conversation between the man and a foreign dignitary. What could they have been plotting? Was the man thinking of trading his loyalty to the highest bidder? His most trusted advisor, Lord Valerius, a man who had served his family for generations, became a focal point of his paranoia. Valerius was too calm, too rational, too reliable. The emperor found himself questioning the man's motives. Was his unwavering loyalty a genuine expression of devotion, or a carefully constructed facade designed to lull him into a false sense of security? He started planting false information, just to test the man's reaction. Even the empress, his beloved wife, did not escape his growing distrust. He studied her, searching for any sign of deception in her beautiful face. Was her affection genuine, or a carefully calculated performance designed to manipulate him? Perhaps she was in league with his enemies, subtly poisoning his mind against his loyal supporters. Or perhaps she knew the prophecy. He wondered how quickly she would find a new husband. If something unfortunate happened to him. And then of course there were his children. This was where the true horror resided, the prophecy. The chilling, inescapable prophecy that foretold his own demise at their hands. He gazed upon them, his own flesh and blood, and saw not innocence and love, but instruments of fate, destined to bring about his downfall. He began to believe their childish misbehavior wasn't just a matter of youthful indiscretion, but the beginning of an intricate plan to undermine his authority. Every cry, every tantrum was an expression of hatred. He thought they were already sharpening their little knives, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He tried to reason with himself, to dismiss these thoughts as the product of stress and exhaustion, but the whispers were too persistent, the paranoia too pervasive. He was trapped in a vicious cycle of suspicion and fear, each feeding the other, driving him further into the abyss of madness. He started implementing increasingly draconian measures, tightening his grip on power, silencing dissent with brutal efficiency. He surrounded himself with loyal guards, men handpicked for their unwavering obedience and ruthless efficiency. He doubled the palace guard, tripled the surveillance, transformed his home into a cage. He began executing individuals that he merely suspected of treason. The paranoia fueled the executions, and the executions fueled the paranoia. His advisors, initially hesitant, soon embraced his increasingly paranoid worldview, vying for his favor by uncovering ever more elaborate conspiracies. The court became a breeding ground for informants and spies, each eager to denounce their rivals to gain the emperor's favor. Truth became a casualty, replaced by suspicion and self-preservation. The emperor, once a just and benevolent ruler, was now a tyrant, driven mad by fear and the chilling echo of the prophecy. He was a man consumed, his mind a battlefield where paranoia and reason waged a constant bloody war. And as the shadows deepened and the whispers grew louder, it became increasingly clear that the emperor's reign was drawing to a terrifying close. The emperor, already teetering on the brink of madness, found himself fixated on the prophecy. It had been a ghost in the palace since his birth, a whispered curse that haunted every corridor, every chamber. But now, it wasn't just a distant threat, a vague premonition of doom. It was a tangible presence, a living, breathing monster that had taken root within his very mind. The words of the prophecy, once a chilling tale told in hushed tones, became a constant, deafening mantra, echoing through the corridors of his thoughts. He would devour his own children to survive. He had tried to ignore it, to laugh it off as the superstition of a bygone era. He had surrounded himself with advisors who dismissed it as nonsense, who assured him that he was a strong, capable ruler, not a monster destined to commit unspeakable acts. But the seed of doubt had been planted long ago, and now, fertilized by paranoia and fear, it had blossomed into a poisonous flower, its tendrils wrapping around his heart and mind, suffocating him with dread. His children. They were no longer just his children. They were instruments of fate, potential agents of his downfall. He saw it in their eyes, in their innocent smiles, in their carefree laughter. It was a subtle defiance, a hidden rebellion, a silent challenge to his authority. Each childish prank, each innocent request, each act of affection was interpreted through the warped lens of the prophecy, twisted into a sinister plot to undermine him, to destroy him. He watched them constantly, scrutinizing their every move, searching for any sign of the darkness that he believed lurked within them. He listened to their conversations, parsing every word for hidden meanings, for veiled threats. He questioned their nurses, their tutors, their playmates, seeking confirmation of his suspicions, desperate to find proof that they were not the innocent children they appeared to be. He saw disloyalty in his eldest son's ambition, in his eagerness to learn, in his desire to prove himself worthy of the throne. He interpreted his second son's gentle nature as weakness, a vulnerability that could be exploited by his enemies. And he viewed his daughter's beauty and charm as a dangerous weapon, a tool that could be used to manipulate him, to seduce him into a false sense of security. The love he once felt for them began to curdle, to sour into a bitter concoction of fear and resentment. He still cared for them, of course, but his affection was now tainted by suspicion, by the nagging doubt that they were not truly his, that they were merely puppets of fate, destined to betray him. He began to distance himself from them, avoiding their company, shunning their affection. He couldn't bear to be near them, to look into their eyes, knowing that they might be the very instruments of his destruction. He felt like a caged animal, trapped between his love for his children and his fear of the prophecy. He wanted to protect them, but he also wanted to protect himself. He consulted with astrologers, with sorcerers, with anyone who might offer him a way out of this terrifying predicament. He sought a ritual, a spell, a potion that could break the curse, that could alter the course of fate. But the answers he received were always vague, ambiguous, offering no real solution, only more questions, more doubts. Some suggested sacrificing them, offering their lives to appease the gods, to avert the prophecy. Others recommended exiling them, sending them far away from the kingdom, where they could no longer pose a threat. But the emperor couldn't bring himself to do either. He couldn't kill his own children, and he couldn't bear to banish them, to condemn them to a life of hardship and exile. He was trapped, caught in a web of his own making, paralyzed by fear and indecision. The prophecy had taken root, burrowing deep into his mind, poisoning his thoughts, twisting his perceptions. He was no longer a rational ruler, but a madman consumed by paranoia, seeing threats where none existed, imagining conspiracies in every shadow. And as his sanity eroded, the prophecy grew stronger, more insistent, demanding its due. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the countdown to the unspeakable had begun. The dismissal of Lord Elmsworth, his most trusted advisor, sent tremors of fear through the palace. Elmsworth, a man renowned for his wisdom and unwavering loyalty, had served the emperor's father, and then the emperor himself with unmatched devotion. He was the rock upon which the kingdom's stability was built, a beacon of reason in a sea of political intrigue. Yet overnight, he was accused of treason, stripped of his titles, and banished from the court. The charges were vague, unsubstantiated, a mere whisper of conspiracy that reeked of the emperor's increasing Paranoia. The official decree spoke of sedition and undermining the authority of the crown. But everyone knew the truth. Elmsworth had become too powerful, too influential, a threat to the emperor's fragile ego. He had dared to offer counsel that the emperor didn't want to hear, voiced dissenting opinions that challenged the emperor's increasingly erratic decisions. His loyalty was unwavering, but his honesty was his downfall. The emperor claimed that Elmsworth was secretly plotting with a foreign power, attempting to destabilize the kingdom and place a rival claimant on the throne. He presented no evidence, offered no proof, relying solely on his own intuitive understanding of Elmsworth's supposed treachery. The court, paralyzed by fear, dared not question the emperor's judgment. Elmsworth was taken from his home in the dead of night, his family left weeping in the streets, his reputation forever tarnished. But the dismissal of Elmsworth was merely the beginning. A wave of accusations swept through the court, targeting anyone who dared to express even the slightest disagreement with the emperor's increasingly bizarre pronouncements. Generals who questioned his military strategies were branded as cowards and traitors, their heads impaled on spikes above the city gates. Advisors who dared to point out the flaws in his economic policies were imprisoned, their estates confiscated, their families left to starve. The emperor's paranoia was a hungry beast, demanding a constant stream of sacrifices. He saw enemies everywhere, even in the faces of his most devoted servants. He became convinced that a vast conspiracy was brewing, a plot to overthrow him and install a puppet ruler on the throne. He imagined secret meetings taking place in the dead of night, coded messages exchanged in hushed tones, daggers hidden beneath flowing robes. One particularly tragic case involved Captain Valeries, commander of the Imperial Guard. Valeries had served the emperor since childhood, a loyal and courageous warrior who had risked his life countless times to protect the crown. He was the emperor's most trusted bodyguard, a man of unwavering integrity and fierce loyalty. But even Valeries couldn't escape the emperor's growing madness. The emperor became convinced that Valeries was secretly planning to assassinate him, that he was waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. He saw malice in Valeries' steady gaze, treachery in his unwavering devotion. He claimed that Valeries had been corrupted by a foreign power, that he was being manipulated by shadowy figures who sought to destabilize the kingdom. Valeries was summoned to the emperor's chambers, unaware of the accusations that had been leveled against him. He stood before the emperor, his head held high, his loyalty unwavering. The emperor, his face contorted with suspicion and fear, accused Valeries of treason, of plotting to overthrow the crown. Valeries protested his innocence, swore on his life that he would never betray the emperor. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The emperor ordered Valeries to be executed immediately, without trial, without even a chance to defend himself. The guards dragged Valeries away, his cries of protest echoing through the palace halls. The execution was swift and brutal, a public spectacle designed to intimidate the court and solidify the emperor's power. The execution of Valeries sent shockwaves of terror through the kingdom. It was a clear signal that no one was safe, that even the most loyal and devoted servants could fall victim to the emperor's madness. Fear became the dominant emotion, silencing dissent and stifling any opposition to the emperor's increasingly tyrannical rule. These weren't isolated incidents, mind you. They were part of a systematic campaign of terror, a deliberate effort to eliminate any perceived threat to the emperor's authority. Loyal servants were falsely accused, tortured into confessing to crimes they didn't commit, and then executed in gruesome public displays. The emperor reveled in the fear he inspired, mistaking it for respect. He believed that by instilling terror in the hearts of his subjects, he could solidify his power and prevent the prophecy from coming to pass. Little did he realize that his actions were only hastening his descent into madness. driving him closer to the very fate he so desperately sought to avoid. The first drops of rain had fallen, and the storm was only just beginning. The stage was set for true madness, an unraveling that would shock the kingdom and forever stain the emperor's legacy with blood and fear. The executions were not justice, but sacrifices to the altar of his paranoia, each one further cementing his descent into the abyss. Medieval wives. Their lives are often portrayed as quiet, domestic, filled with spinning wheels and endless chores. But behind the closed doors of castles and humble cottages, a different story unfolded, one of secret desires, clever manipulations, and a desperate need to please. We often think of the sexual expectations in those times only going one way. How were wives to actually please their lords? Now, before we delve into the weird part of our title, let's establish a baseline. Medieval society was undeniably patriarchal. A wife's primary duty was to produce heirs, preferably male ones, to secure the family line and inheritance. Sexual pleasure for women was rarely considered, if at all. The church, of course, cast a long shadow, viewing sex primarily as a procreative act. Any deviation from this purpose was, well, sinful, but human nature, as it always does, found a way. Medieval wives weren't passive automatons. They had agency, desires, and a vested interest in maintaining a harmonious, or at least functional marriage. And that often meant finding ways to satisfy their husbands, even if it meant exploring practices that weren't exactly sanctioned by the church or openly discussed. One of the most common, and perhaps least scandalous, secrets involved the art of seduction. Wives understood the power of beauty and presentation. They meticulously crafted their appearance, using natural dyes and cosmetics to enhance their features. Think kohl for the eyes, rouge made from berries, and herbal concoctions to scent their hair and skin. Clothing played a crucial role, too. While modest in public, a wife might choose more revealing garments for the privacy of her chamber, perhaps. A low-cut chemise or a gown that hinted at the curves beneath. Remember, fabric was expensive and colors even more so. The right ensemble spoke volumes. Beyond appearance, wives cultivated their personalities to please their spouses. They learned to be attentive listeners, offering sympathy and support to their husbands' concerns. They mastered the art of conversation, engaging in intelligent discourse and providing stimulating companionship. Many wives learned to play musical instruments, sing, or recite poetry, providing entertainment and adding a touch of refinement to the household. These accomplishments weren't just for show. They were strategic tools for cultivating intimacy and solidifying their position within the marriage. Now, let's venture into slightly more uncharted territory. Medieval medical texts, often consulted by women for advice on health and beauty, sometimes contained recipes for love potions and aphrodisiacs. These concoctions, often based on herbs, spices, and even animal products, were believed to enhance libido and promote sexual desire. While their efficacy is questionable by modern standards, the fact that these recipes existed speaks to a hidden world of female agency and experimentation. Imagine a wife secretly adding a pinch of saffron or a few drops of honeyed wine to her husband's supper, hoping to ignite a spark. It's a subtle act of rebellion, a quiet assertion of her own desires within the confines of a restrictive society. Oral traditions also hinted at the use of marital aids, objects designed to enhance sexual pleasure. While concrete evidence is scarce, given the taboo nature of the subject, it's not unreasonable to assume that some wives employed creative solutions to spice things up in the bedroom. Think of intricately carved wooden beads, scented oils, or even strategically placed cushions designed to enhance certain positions. These were, of course, secrets closely guarded, whispered between trusted friends or passed down through generations of women. Medieval literature, while often romanticized, also offers glimpses into the realities of marital relationships. Body Tales and satirical poems frequently mocked cuckolded husbands, suggesting that some wives sought sexual satisfaction outside of marriage. While adultery was a serious offense, punishable by law and condemned by the church, it undoubtedly occurred. In these situations, a wife might engage in a secret affair, driven by a desire for affection, companionship, or simply a more fulfilling sexual experience. But let's be clear, not all weird sexual practices were consensual or desirable. In a society where women had limited rights and were often considered property, marital rape was a grim reality. A husband's sexual demands, no matter how unpleasant or unwanted, were often seen as his right. Wives may have resorted to various tactics to avoid or mitigate these unwanted encounters, feigning illness, pleading exhaustion, or even employing cunning strategies to distract or disinterest their husbands. The power dynamics of medieval marriage were complex and often fraught with tension. While some wives found ways to assert their agency and find pleasure within the confines of their situation, others were trapped in abusive or unfulfilling relationships. The secrets they kept, the strategies they employed, and the risks they took offer a fascinating glimpse into the hidden lives of medieval women, revealing a world far more nuanced and complex than we often imagine. It's a world where obedience and subversion intertwined, where desire and duty clashed, and where the pursuit of pleasure, however forbidden, remained a powerful force, even in the darkest of times. The medieval church, a monolithic institution wielding immense power, cast a long, imposing shadow over every facet of medieval life. And naturally, sex was no exception. Forget the modern concept of personal autonomy. Back then, the church was the ultimate arbiter of morality, dictating not only what was permissible, but also defining what constituted sin, downright perversion. Their perspective on sex wasn't exactly a recipe for liberation. Let's just say that the foundation of the church's sexual doctrine rested on the concept of procreation. Sex, in their eyes, was primarily for the purpose of producing offspring, ensuring the continuation of the human race, and filling the ranks of the faithful. Anything that deviated from this God-ordained purpose was viewed with suspicion, if not outright condemnation. Think of it as a very, very strict reproductive imperative. Marriage, of course, was the only divinely sanctioned context for sexual activity. It was a sacred union, a sacrament blessed by the church, and the ideal environment for raising children. However, even within marriage, there were restrictions. The church actively discouraged any form of sexual expression that was deemed overly pleasurable or not directly aimed at conception. Basically, enjoy it too much, and you're flirting with sin. Now, let's talk about those perversions. The church had a whole laundry list of sexual acts that they considered sinful and unnatural. Non-procreative acts were high on the list. This included things like oral sex, anal sex, and even the use of contraception, which, let's be honest, was fairly rudimentary in the Middle Ages anyway. The logic was simple. If it doesn't lead to babies, it's a waste of God's gift and a violation of His divine plan. Masturbation was another major no-no, viewed as a sin against oneself, a misuse of the body's reproductive capabilities. It was considered a form of self-pollution, a rejection of God's intended purpose for human sexuality. Imagine the guilt trips. Same-sex relationships were, unsurprisingly, condemned in no uncertain terms. The church based its stance on biblical passages that were interpreted as prohibiting homosexual acts, labeling them as sodomy, and viewing them as a grave offense against God's natural order. The consequences for engaging in same-sex relationships could range from social ostracism to severe legal penalties, depending on the severity of the transgression and the prevailing attitudes of the time. We will dive deeper into the specifics of same-sex relationships soon. However, adultery, naturally, was strictly forbidden. Marital fidelity was considered a cornerstone of Christian society, and any violation of the marriage vows was seen as a betrayal of God, one's spouse, and the entire community. Adultery carried heavy social and religious consequences, and in some cases could even lead to legal repercussions. But here's where things get interesting. Despite the Church's rigid pronouncements on sexual morality, the reality of medieval life was far more complex and nuanced. Human desires and behaviors rarely conform neatly to theological dictates, and the Middle Ages were no exception. While the Church preached abstinence and marital fidelity, the historical record reveals a vibrant, if often hidden, undercurrent of sexual activity that defied these restrictions. We know this through court records of the time and even works of art. Brothels flourished in many medieval cities, often tolerated, if not officially sanctioned, by local authorities. Prostitution provided an outlet for sexual desires that fell outside the confines of marriage, and it served as a source of income for countless women, many of whom were forced into the trade by poverty or circumstance. We'll get more into brothels soon, but just keep in mind that it goes to show how church teachings sometimes went ignored, or simply unacknowledged. Furthermore, the prevalence of bastardy, children born out of wedlock, suggests that premarital sex and extramarital affairs were far more common than the Church would have liked to admit. While these activities were often conducted in secret, they nonetheless provide evidence of a disconnect between the Church's ideals and the realities of everyday life. The Church's attempts to control sexual behavior were also hampered by the limitations of its enforcement mechanisms. While the Church had the power to excommunicate individuals and impose penance, its ability to directly regulate private behavior was limited. Much depended on the willingness of individuals to confess their sins and submit to the Church's authority. It was like a massive honor system that was constantly being exploited. Moreover, the Church's own ranks were not immune to sexual transgressions. Stories of corrupt priests and nuns engaging in illicit affairs were not uncommon, undermining the Church's moral authority and fueling skepticism about its pronouncements on sexual morality. Hypocrisy, it seems, is a timeless human trait. In conclusion, the Church's perspective on medieval sex was one of strict regulation and control, aimed at promoting procreation and maintaining social order. However, the realities of medieval life often clashed with these ideals, resulting in a complex and often contradictory landscape of sexual behavior. While the Church's influence on medieval society was undeniable, its ability to dictate every aspect of people's private lives was ultimately limited. The medieval heart, it seems, often yearned for desires that the Church couldn't, or wouldn't, understand. Now, let's delve into a world far removed from royal courts and chilling prophecies. A world of bustling streets, flickering candlelight, and hidden doorways, the medieval brothels and the pervasive reality of prostitution. It's a topic often glossed over in history books, shrouded in shame and moral condemnation. But the truth is, prostitution was a deeply ingrained part of medieval society, its tendrils reaching into every corner of life, from the poorest peasant villages to the grandest cathedral cities. Forget the romanticized image of virtuous knights and chaste maidens. The Middle Ages, for all its chivalry and religious fervor, was a world of harsh realities, where sex was often transactional, and morality a complex and often contradictory concept. Prostitution wasn't just tolerated. In many instances it was actively regulated and even considered a necessary evil. Think about it. A society largely structured around arranged marriages, often driven by political or economic necessity. Love and mutual attraction were secondary concerns, if they factored in at all. Men, particularly those from noble or merchant families, were often forced into marriages with women they barely knew, women who were expected to bear children and manage the household, but not necessarily to provide emotional or sexual fulfillment. So, where did these men turn to satisfy their desires? Often, the answer was brothels. These establishments, ranging from squalid back rooms in taverns to relatively luxurious houses with multiple rooms and servants, were a ubiquitous feature of medieval towns and cities. They offered a space for men to indulge their desires, to escape the constraints of their marriages, and to find companionship, however fleeting, outside the rigid social structures that governed their lives. Now, before you conjure up images of scandalous dens of iniquity, it's important to understand the surprisingly nuanced attitude towards prostitution in the Middle Ages. While the Church officially condemned it as a sin, in practice, many local authorities saw it as a way to control and contain male sexuality, preventing it from spilling over into more disruptive or dangerous behaviors, like rape or adultery, which were seen as far greater threats to social order. Many towns even licensed and regulated brothels, levying taxes on their earnings and establishing rules to govern their operation. Prostitutes in some cases were required to wear distinctive clothing, often brightly colored dresses or distinctive hats, to identify themselves and separate them from respectable women. This wasn't necessarily intended to shame them, but rather to maintain order and prevent confusion. Think of it as a medieval version of occupational uniform. The social standing of prostitutes was, of course, precarious. They occupied a liminal space, existing on the fringes of society, simultaneously ostracized and tolerated, condemned and utilized. They were often subjected to abuse and exploitation, both by their clients and by the brothel keepers who profited from their labor. But some managed to achieve a degree of autonomy and even wealth, particularly in larger cities where they catered to wealthier clientele. We should also remember that the women who entered prostitution came from a variety of backgrounds. Some were driven by poverty, forced to sell their bodies to survive in a world with limited economic opportunities for women. Others were victims of violence or abandonment, left with no other means of support. And some, perhaps surprisingly, chose prostitution as a way to gain a degree of independence and control over their own lives, a stark contrast to the often restrictive roles available to women in medieval society. And let's not forget the economic impact. Brothels weren't just places of sexual transaction. They were also businesses that employed cooks, cleaners, musicians, and other support staff. They contributed to the local economy, generating revenue through taxes and providing employment for a significant number of people. In some towns, brothels were even owned or managed by civic authorities, further blurring the lines between morality and pragmatism. Beyond the brothels, prostitution also took place in a more informal setting. Traveling merchants, soldiers on campaign, and pilgrims on long journeys often sought out temporary companionship, turning to women in taverns, roadside inns, or even in the fields and forests. These encounters were often fleeting and anonymous, but they were nonetheless a pervasive part of medieval life. The Church, despite its official condemnation, often struggled to control the spread of prostitution. While preachers thundered against the evils of lust and fornication, their words often fell on deaf ears, particularly in the face of the overwhelming social and economic pressures that fueled the demand for sexual services. Some religious orders even attempted to rehabilitate prostitutes, establishing Magdalene asylums where they could repent their sins and learn a trade. Ultimately, the prevalence and social acceptance of prostitution in the Middle Ages speaks to a complex and often contradictory reality. It was a reflection of the social, economic, and religious forces that shaped medieval society, a testament to the enduring human desire for sex and companionship, and a stark reminder that morality is rarely a simple matter of black and white. While modern sensibilities may recoil at the idea of licensed brothels and regulated prostitution, it's important to understand these practices within the context of their time, as a reflection of the values, beliefs, and realities of the medieval world. Okay, let's delve into a slightly more intimate side of medieval life. You might be picturing knights in shining armor and damsels in distress, but what about what happened behind the castle doors? We're talking about the rather fascinating, and sometimes eyebrow-raising, world of medieval sex toys and tools. Now, before you conjure up images of modern-day adult stores, let's get one thing straight. The medieval period wasn't exactly known for its, open-mindedness when it came to sexuality. The church, as we've touched on before, held significant sway, dictating what was considered natural and what was deemed sinful. Pleasure, for the most part, was meant to be a byproduct of procreation, not an end in itself. But human nature, as it often does, found a way around these restrictions. So what kind of tools were available to those seeking a bit of extra spice in their lives? Well, let's start with the slightly less explicit options. Think about the materials readily available at the time: wood, leather, bone, and even various metals. These were the raw ingredients for many everyday objects, and it's not a huge leap to imagine them being adapted for other, more pleasurable purposes. For example, consider the humble dildo. While mass production was still centuries away, rudimentary versions crafted from wood or leather were certainly possibilities. These wouldn't have been the sleek, anatomically correct models we see today, of course. Think more along the lines of roughly carved shapes, perhaps adorned with decorative elements, or even rudimentary handles for better grip. Leather, when properly treated, could be molded and shaped into surprisingly realistic forms. Stuffed with cloth or other materials, leather could create soft and flexible tools. One could imagine skilled craftsmen using leather to create custom pieces that would provide the desired sensation. But it wasn't just about imitation. Sometimes the focus was on novelty. Consider the potential use of gourds or root vegetables. These natural objects, with their unique shapes and textures, could have been repurposed for sexual exploration. Imagine a carefully hollowed-out gourd, perhaps filled with warm water or oil for added sensation, or a textured root vegetable used for external stimulation. While perhaps not the most hygienic options by modern standards, they were readily available and easily disposable. Beyond these relatively straightforward options, we start to enter the realm of the truly unusual. Remember, the concept of sexual pleasure wasn't widely discussed or documented, so much of this is based on inference and speculation, piecing together clues from surviving artifacts and historical texts. One fascinating area to consider is the use of, well, let's call them enhancing devices. We know that certain herbs and plants were believed to have aphrodisiac properties. Might those same resources have been used to create topical creams or ointments designed to enhance sensitivity? It's certainly plausible. And what about the more ambitious inventions? Consider the potential for using simple machines to amplify sensation. Imagine a crude rocking device, perhaps powered by a hand crank, designed to provide rhythmic stimulation. It sounds far-fetched perhaps, but medieval ingenuity shouldn't be underestimated. After all, they were capable of building complex cathedrals and siege engines. A simple sex toy, by comparison, would have been relatively straightforward. Of course, the availability of these tools would have varied greatly depending on social class. The wealthy would have had access to skilled artisans who could craft bespoke items from expensive materials. The peasantry, on the other hand, would have had to rely on their own ingenuity and the resources readily available to them. And let's not forget the role of folklore and superstition. Certain stones, crystals, and other natural objects were believed to possess magical properties. It's not hard to imagine these items being incorporated into sexual practices, either for their supposed aphrodisiac qualities or for the belief that they could enhance fertility or protect against evil spirits. Now, the question of whether or not these devices were actually effective is, of course, impossible to answer definitively. But the very fact that people went to the trouble of creating and using them suggests that they served some purpose, whether it was to enhance physical pleasure, to explore sexual boundaries, or simply to add a bit of excitement to their lives. It's important to remember that the medieval period was a time of great creativity and innovation, even in the most unexpected areas. While the church may have frowned upon unbridled sexuality, human desire found a way to express itself, often in surprising and ingenious ways. So, the next time you think about the Middle Ages, remember that it wasn't all just castles and crusades. It was also a time of secret desires, hidden pleasures, and the constant human quest for, well, a little bit of fun. It just looked a little different back then, crafted from wood, leather, and a healthy dose of medieval ingenuity. Some sex. Relationships in the medieval period. A topic shrouded in as much mystery as it is misconception. We often paint the past with broad strokes, assuming a monolithic view on social issues. But the truth, as always, is far more nuanced. While the Church's condemnation of what they termed sodomy is well documented, the lived experiences of those who engaged in same-sex relationships are significantly harder to unearth. Official line, dictated from pulpits and enshrined in canon law, was unequivocally negative. The Bible, specifically passages from Leviticus, provided the theological ammunition. Sodomy, broadly defined as any non-procreative sexual act, was considered a grave sin, an affront to God's natural order. Punishments ranged from penance and excommunication to, in some cases, death. But doctrine and reality rarely align perfectly. The enforcement of these laws varied wildly depending on the time period, the region, and the social status of the individuals involved. A peasant engaging in homosexual acts likely faced harsher consequences than a wealthy merchant or a member of the clergy. Yes, you heard that right. Even within the church itself, where vows of celibacy were ostensibly observed, same-sex relationships were not unheard of. Historical records are, understandably, incomplete and often coded. Openly declaring same-sex desire was a dangerous game. What we find instead are glimpses, fragments of evidence that hint at a more complex reality. Poems, stories, and legal documents, often veiled in metaphor and euphemism, offer tantalizing clues. Consider the practice of brotherhood or spiritual friendship, common among monks and other religious figures. These bonds were often intensely emotional and deeply personal. While not explicitly sexual in nature, some historians argue that these relationships provided a framework for intimacy and affection that could, in certain cases, cross the line into physical intimacy. The very intensity of these bonds, the language of love and devotion used to describe them, raises questions about the boundaries that were being observed. Similarly, in secular society, stories of close friendships between men, sharing beds, and living intimately, abound. Again, it's difficult to definitively label these relationships as homosexual, but the level of closeness and affection suggests a spectrum of possibilities beyond purely platonic companionship. The very lack of explicit language condemning these friendships, provided they didn't openly defy procreative intent, suggests a degree of tolerance or perhaps willful ignorance from the wider society. Courtly love, a dominant theme in medieval literature, also offers some interesting avenues for exploration. While primarily focused on heterosexual relationships, the intense emotional devotion and idealized worship often associated with courtly love could arguably be transposed onto same-sex relationships. The emphasis on spiritual connection and unattainable desire, rather than purely physical gratification, might have provided a framework for expressing same-sex attraction in a socially acceptable way. Furthermore, the concept of gender itself was arguably more fluid in the medieval period than we often assume. The strict binary of male and female, so rigidly enforced in modern society, may have been less clearly defined, allowing for a greater degree of flexibility in terms of sexual identity and expression. Transgender individuals, while certainly not embraced, existed. And their presence challenges our assumptions about fixed categories of gender and sexuality. Accounts of cross-dressing, particularly in theatrical performances and festivals, highlight the blurring of gender lines and the potential for subverting social norms. The legal records, while primarily focused on punishing sodomy, also provide valuable insights. The very fact that such laws existed suggests that same-sex acts were not uncommon. Cases of prosecution are rare, but they do occur, offering glimpses into the specific acts that were deemed most offensive and the social anxieties surrounding them. Analysis of these cases reveals that the severity of the punishment often depended on factors beyond the mere act itself, such as the social status of the individuals involved, the presence of witnesses, and the prevailing moral climate. It's important to acknowledge the power imbalances that often existed in these relationships. Forced sexual acts, regardless of the genders involved, were undoubtedly a reality in the medieval period, and these acts should not be romanticized or excused. The vulnerability of individuals in positions of powerlessness, such as servants, slaves, or prisoners, made them particularly susceptible to exploitation. Ultimately, understanding same-sex relationships in the medieval period requires a cautious and nuanced approach. The evidence is fragmented, the language is coded, and the biases of the historical record are undeniable. But by carefully examining the available sources, by questioning our own assumptions, and by acknowledging the complexities of human desire, we can begin to paint a more complete and accurate picture of this often overlooked aspect of medieval life. It's a story of repression and resistance, of condemnation and acceptance, of secrets whispered in the shadows and love blossoming in the most unexpected of places. Now, let's delve into the murky depths of medieval sexuality, a realm often shrouded in taboo and punctuated by acts that modern sensibilities would deem shocking. We're talking about bestiality and other related accounts, practices largely condemned by the Church, but nevertheless present in the historical record. Let's be clear. Documenting these kinds of things in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly a priority. So, reliable statistics? Forget about it. What we're relying on are primarily court records, ecclesiastical pronouncements, and occasionally, literary allusions. And remember, these accounts are often filtered through a lens of moral judgment, making it difficult to discern the actual prevalence of these acts from the level of societal disapproval they elicited. Bestiality, in its simplest definition, is sexual contact between a human and an animal. While we might recoil at the thought, historical evidence suggests that it occurred, though its scale remains a matter of speculation. Court records from across Europe, from England to France to the Holy Roman Empire, occasionally mention accusations of bestiality. The punishments for such acts could be severe, ranging from excommunication in public, shaming to imprisonment, and even death. The severity often depended on several factors: the social status of the accused, the type of animal involved, and the prevailing local laws. A peasant accused of having relations with a farm animal would likely face a different fate than a noble caught in a similar act. And of course, the Church wielded considerable influence, shaping both legal and moral attitudes towards these practices. It's important to note, too, that the medieval understanding of sexuality differed significantly from our own. The concept of sexual orientation, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist. Sexual acts were often categorized not by the gender or species of the participants, but by whether they conformed to the procreative function of marriage. Any act that deviated from this perceived norm, including bestiality, was deemed a sin and a perversion. Now, what kinds of animals were typically involved? Well, farm animals, unsurprisingly, feature prominently in the records. Cows, sheep, goats, and pigs seem to have been the most common victims, although there are also accounts involving dogs, horses, and even birds. In some cases, The accusations involved not just sexual contact, but also the killing and consumption of the animal, blurring the lines between bestiality and other forms of animal abuse. Beyond bestiality, other taboo acts also surface in the historical record. These include acts that we might today consider non-consensual, such as rape and sexual assault, as well as practices involving the mutilation or desecration of corpses. Again, the details are often sketchy and unreliable, but the fact that these accusations were made suggests that these acts, however rare, did occur. One particularly grim example is the practice of necromancy, which sometimes involved sexual acts performed on or near corpses. This was seen not just as a violation of the dead, but also as a form of witchcraft, a way of summoning demonic forces or manipulating the spirit world. Accusations of necromancy were often used as political weapons, a way of discrediting or eliminating rivals by associating them with the forces of evil. It's crucial to approach these accounts with a healthy dose of skepticism. Many of the accusations were likely false, motivated by personal animosity, political agendas, or simply the desire to enforce social norms. The medieval legal system was far from perfect, and innocent people were undoubtedly convicted of crimes they didn't commit. Furthermore, the historical record is inherently biased. It reflects the perspectives of the elite, the educated, and the powerful, while the voices of ordinary people, particularly women and the poor, are often silenced. This means that our understanding of medieval sexuality is necessarily incomplete, filtered through a lens of class, gender, and power. So, while we can glean some insights into the taboo acts of the medieval era, we must do so with caution and nuance. We must recognize the limitations of the available evidence, the biases inherent in the historical record, and the vast differences between medieval and modern understandings of sexuality. It's a difficult topic, a dark corner of history that's best approached with sensitivity and a critical eye. The emperor's descent wasn't a sudden plunge into darkness, but a slow, agonizing spiral. It began subtly, with whispers and shadows, evolving into a chilling symphony of paranoia and dread. He started viewing the very fabric of his court, his family, as instruments of his impending demise. Treason, once a distant threat, now pulsed beneath every smile, echoed in every whispered conversation. Lord Arion, his most trusted advisor, a man who had served the emperor since childhood, became an object of intense scrutiny. Arion's loyalty had always been unwavering, his counsel wise and measured. But in the emperor's twisted mind, Arion's very competence became a source of suspicion. Was Arion truly loyal, or was he a puppet master, subtly manipulating the emperor for his own gain? The emperor began to see Arion's advice, once valued, as thinly veiled attempts to control him, to steer him down a path that would ultimately lead to his downfall. He tasked spies to follow Arion, to scour through his correspondence, to unearth any evidence of betrayal. The reports came back clean, but the emperor dismissed them as clever deceptions, further proof of Arion's cunning. The empress, once his confidant and source of solace, was now regarded with a mixture of fear and resentment. He questioned her motives, her affections, her very presence in his life. Was her love genuine, or was it a carefully constructed facade, designed to lull him into a false sense of security? He remembered the prophecy, the chilling foretelling of a king betrayed by those closest to him. Could his wife, the woman he had sworn to cherish, be the one to orchestrate his demise? He started to distance himself from her, avoiding her touch, her gaze, fearing that even the slightest contact could expose him to her treachery. The empress, sensing the shift in his demeanor, pleaded with him, desperate to understand the cause of his sudden coldness. But the emperor remained aloof, trapped in his own world of paranoia, unable to trust even the woman he loved. But it was his children, his own flesh and blood, who became the focal point of his terror. The prophecy loomed large, a constant reminder of the horrifying fate that awaited him. He saw in their innocent faces not love and hope, but the potential for betrayal, the seeds of his destruction. He scrutinized their every action, their every word, searching for any sign of the darkness that supposedly resided within them. Their laughter sounded like mocking taunts, their embraces felt like constricting chains. He began to isolate them, keeping them away from the court, fearing that they would be corrupted by the poisonous atmosphere of intrigue and ambition. He replaced their loyal nurses and tutors with guards chosen for their blind obedience, men who would follow his orders without question, men who would protect him from the perceived threat posed by his own children. The children, confused and frightened by the sudden change, grew withdrawn and silent. They no longer approached their father with the same carefree joy, their innocent eyes now filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. The emperor, seeing their fear, interpreted it as proof of their guilt, confirmation of the prophecy's chilling. Prediction. Sleep became a torment, haunted by vivid nightmares of betrayal and violence. He dreamt of his children rising up against him, their innocent faces contorted with hatred, their hands stained with his blood. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, unable to shake the horrifying images from his mind. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and the emperor grew increasingly convinced that the prophecy was coming to pass. He saw signs of treachery everywhere, omens of his impending doom. The kingdom itself seemed to conspire against him, the very air thick with malice and foreboding. Driven to the brink of madness, the emperor began to take drastic measures. He purged the court, executing anyone he suspected of disloyalty, regardless of their past service or their lack of evidence. The executions were swift and brutal, a public display of the emperor's power, a chilling warning to anyone who dared to defy him. Fear gripped the kingdom, silencing dissent and transforming the once vibrant court into a wasteland of suspicion and terror. The emperor, isolated and paranoid, had become a tyrant, his reign defined by fear and violence. But even as he consolidated his power, the emperor remained haunted by the prophecy. He knew that the purges were merely a temporary solution, a futile attempt to postpone the inevitable. The true threat, he believed, lay within his own family, within his own children. He began to contemplate the unthinkable, the horrifying act that the prophecy foretold. He wrestled with his conscience, torn between his love for his children and his desperate desire to survive. But the paranoia consumed him, eroding his sanity and driving him further down the path of darkness. The emperor, once a just and benevolent ruler, had become a prisoner of his own fear, a monster consumed by the very prophecy he sought to escape. The descent into darkness was complete, and the stage was set for the final horrifying act.